The three men who never died. It may sound unbelievable, right? The Bible, although a collection of ancient stories, is full of surprising stories and facts that teach us more about the nature of God, faith, and life itself. But have you ever wondered if there are people who did not die and instead were taken to heaven by God in a special way? Well, today you will discover those three men, and the most incredible thing is that the Bible clearly tells us how and why they never experienced death. Who are they? Why didn't they die? Stay until the end, because this is one of those stories that will make you think. Death in the Bible. Before talking about these three incredible men, it is essential to understand how the Bible views death. In the scriptures, death is not simply the end of everything, but rather a transition from earthly life to what comes next. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, God tells Adam, "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." This verse shows us that all human beings, because we were created from the dust of the earth, return to it after our death. This establishes a basic truth. Death is a natural part of life. Although it can be something sad and painful, the Bible teaches that it is a necessary step in the cycle of human existence. However, throughout the scriptures, we also find moments where God demonstrates supernatural power, doing something beyond what we normally understand, such as what happened to these three men who never died. Death, as we know, is inevitable for all human beings, but it is also true that God has absolute control over life and death. He is the one who gives life and the only one who can decide when and how people will die. Sometimes he allows death to come at a specific moment, and other times he acts miraculously to intervene in that process. The reason for this may be to teach us something important, to glorify his name, or simply because of his sovereign will. In fact, in some cases, God chooses to take certain people in a special way, as with these three men, who did not pass through death like everyone else, but were taken directly by God. This raises many questions about the nature of life, death, and how God interacts with us. It is fascinating to think that these three men lived such unique lives that God took them from the earth without them dying. These stories are astonishing and make us reflect on God's power and his plan for his children. Why did God choose these individuals for something so extraordinary? This type of event invites us to ask deep questions about our own lives and our relationship with God. However, before delving into the details of their stories, it is important to know who these three men were and what made them so special in God's eyes. The first, Enoch. The first of these three men who never died is Enoch. Enoch is a character from the Old Testament and was Noah's great-grandfather. The Bible tells us that Enoch lived for 365 years, which is already a considerable amount of time. But what truly stands out about his life is what happened at the end of it. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, we find a very surprising verse that says, "And Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him." This verse reveals that instead of dying like everyone else, Enoch was taken directly to heaven by God without experiencing death. This is one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible and demonstrates such a deep level of communion with God that he decided to prevent Enoch from experiencing death. The passage from Genesis chapter 5, verse 24 is one of the most mysterious and astonishing because Enoch was the only human being who never experienced death. But why was he the only one? What did Enoch do to be chosen for this special treatment from God? The key seems to lie in the way Enoch lived his life. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5, we find more details about Enoch. By faith, Enoch was translated so that he did not see death, and he was not found because God translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. This verse tells us that Enoch lived by faith in a way that deeply pleased God. He was not only a righteous man, but also lived a life so close to God that God took him for himself without him having to die. The reason why Enoch was taken to heaven without dying is because he lived in a way that pleased God. This teaches us that a life of genuine faith and a close relationship with God are highly valuable to him. It is truly astonishing to think that, although death is inevitable for everyone, Enoch was one of the few who lived in such a way that God decided to spare him from death. Considering that all of us, without exception, are destined to die someday, Enoch's life becomes a profound lesson about what it means to live in such close communion with God, that we not only change our lives here on earth, but also that God chooses to deal with us in a unique way. This leads us to an important reflection. How can we apply this to our own lives? If Enoch was taken by God because he lived in a way that pleased him, what does it mean for us to walk so closely with God as Enoch did? Although we cannot prevent death like Enoch, we can live in such a way that pleases God, and that each day our life draws closer to him. Enoch is an example that a life of faith and communion with God can transform our existence, and being pleasing to God is the greatest purpose we should pursue. Enoch's story also teaches us the importance of living with a sincere and deep relationship with God. It's not just about believing in him, but walking with him as Enoch did. This life close to God leads us to have a different perspective on everything we do, because it helps us live with an eternal purpose. Walking with God doesn't mean we won't face difficulties or go through hard times, but it does mean we have a relationship of trust and obedience in which we can rest. Although we cannot avoid death like Enoch, we can ensure that our days are filled with a purpose that reflects God's love and will, drawing closer to him each day. Enoch lived a life of faith, obedience, and closeness to God, and for that reason, he was honored in a unique and special way. His example invites us to live in the same manner, walking with God every day. The second is Elijah. The second man in the Bible who never died was Elijah, a great prophet who appears in the book of 2 Kings. Elijah is known for being a brave man who defended God and confronted false prophets during a very difficult time for Israel. During that period, the people of Israel had turned away from God, and many followed the prophets of Baal. Elijah, with unwavering faith, challenged these false prophets and demonstrated God's power by causing fire to come down from heaven to consume an offering. But the most astonishing event in Elijah's life occurs in 2 Kings 2:11, where we find one of the most extraordinary events in the Bible. And it happened that as they were walking and talking, behold, a chariot of fire with horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. This passage is remarkable because Elijah was taken to heaven in a fiery chariot without experiencing death, something that had never happened before to any other human. This moment is unique in the Bible. Elijah does not die physically like everyone else, but is taken to heaven in a supernatural form, wrapped in a whirlwind, while a chariot of fire separates him from his disciple Elisha. The chariot of fire and the horses of fire were not only a spectacular way to show how Elijah was taken to heaven, but also symbolize God's majesty. Elijah is taken up in a glorious manner, not only as a prophet, but as a faithful man who fulfilled his mission on earth. This event shows us that when we live for God's glory, he can make us participants in extraordinary acts. It is a reminder that God has absolute control over life and death, and can do whatever he wishes with those he has called and used for his purposes. So, why didn't Elijah die like everyone else? The answer seems to be related to his faithfulness to God and his mission. Elijah was a man of great faith who dedicated himself completely to fulfilling God's call. He was not only a prophet, but also a powerful intercessor who prayed and cried out for Israel's restoration. In fact, one of Elijah's most outstanding characteristics is that he fervently prayed for his people, interceding for them to return to God. Elijah remained steadfast in his faith, even when most of the people of Israel had turned away from God. This dedication to his mission and his commitment to God were so profound that instead of dying, he was taken directly to heaven, demonstrating how special his relationship with God was. God rewarded him uniquely for his life of service and obedience. Elijah's life is a clear example of what it means to live for the glory of God. When we dedicate our lives to doing God's will, he can use us in powerful ways, just as he did with Elijah. Although not all of us will be taken to heaven in the spectacular way Elijah was, his story shows us that God can make us part of something much greater if we live with courage, obedience, and faith. In our daily lives, Elijah's story inspires us to face challenges with bravery, knowing that God is with us. Like Elijah, we too can be instruments of God in a world that often turns away from him. Living with faith and dedication to his purpose can open doors for us to experience his power in amazing ways. So, like Elijah, we can live bravely and faithfully, facing everything with the certainty that God is by our side. The third man, Moses. The third man in the Bible who never died, or rather whose death was handled in a unique way by God, is Moses. Moses is one of the most important and fundamental figures in all of biblical history. While most people in the Bible experience death in a common way, what happened to Moses is very special. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 5 and 6, we read, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth-peor. And no one knows his burial place to this day." This verse tells us that Moses, although he died in the land of Moab, was not buried in a conventional way, but God himself buried him. The remarkable thing about this story is that God himself was the one who buried Moses and hid his body. The Bible does not tell us why God did this, but it is very significant that Moses never had a known tomb. This leaves the door open for many interpretations. Some people believe that God protected Moses' body in a special way so it would not be found. It is possible that God did not want the people of Israel to honor his tomb improperly or turn it into an object of worship, so he decided to hide it. This detail becomes even more mysterious when we read in Jude chapter 1 verse 9 that the archangel Michael had a dispute with Satan over Moses' body. This rare incident suggests that the death of Moses and his body was so important to God that even an angel had to intervene to prevent Satan from taking control over the body. This unique event shows us that God especially honors those who have been faithful to his call, even in death. Moses was an incredible leader, chosen by God to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. During his life, he faced many difficulties, doubts, and tests, but he always remained faithful to the mission God entrusted to him. Although Moses did not enter the Promised Land due to his disobedience at a specific moment, God honored him in an extraordinary way by not allowing his body to be treated like that of any other person. Moses' death, although common in the fact that he died, was unique in the way God handled his departure. What we can learn from Moses is that even when facing death, God has a perfect plan for each of us. Moses was a man who went through many trials and challenges, but he never lost his faith in God. Although he did not live to see the Promised Land as he had hoped, his life was a story of obedience and total surrender to God's will. This teaches us that although our lives do not always unfold as we expect, God always honors faithfulness and service to his call. Moses' life did not end with his death, but God gave him special treatment even at the end of his life because his service to God was unique. It is interesting to note that while Enoch and Elijah were taken to heaven without dying, Moses died in a different way. However, God gave him a kind of honor that in many ways surpassed even death itself. The Bible shows that although his death was physical, God prepared something special for him in the afterlife. The disappearance of his body and the fact that God buried him secretly are ways in which he demonstrates that his plan for our lives is much greater than we understand. Even when we face the trials of life and death, We must trust that God has a divine purpose in everything that happens. Moses' story also teaches us that God has complete control over all things, including our life and death. Moses was a man of faith, prayer, and sacrifice. Despite difficulties, he always remained steadfast in his mission. God entrusted him with the responsibility of leading the people of Israel during one of the most difficult times in their history. Although Moses was not perfect and made mistakes, God showed him favor by giving him a life full of purpose and honoring him even after his death. This is a reminder that service to God is never in vain, and that he always honors those who fully dedicate themselves to his cause, even if we do not always understand the full plan. In the end, the life and death of Moses show us that God has a divine plan for each of us, even in death. Although we do not know everything that happened at the moment of Moses' death, we can trust that God took extraordinary measures to honor this great leader of faith. This act of kindness and respect toward Moses reminds us that, as believers, we must live our lives with the certainty that God is in control of everything, even our death. If we follow His will faithfully, we can be assured that He will honor our lives in a way that goes beyond what we understand now. In summary, the three men in the Bible who never died, Enoch, Elijah, and Moses, teach us important lessons about our relationship with God. Each of them was uniquely treated by God, and their lives show us how to live according to God's will. They can lead us to amazing experiences. Although death is something everyone must face someday, their stories remind us that God has absolute control over life and death, and He can do whatever He wants with our lives, even in the final moments. These men were no more special than us, but their lives and faith demonstrated such a close commitment to God that He honored them in a unique way. What we can learn from these three men is that walking with God not only brings peace and purpose in this life, but also has eternal repercussions. The lives of Enoch, Elijah, and Moses teach us that when we live according to God's plans, our lives can have an impact far beyond what we imagine. God not only wants us to follow His commandments in this life, but He also has eternal purposes for us. By living with faith and obedience, we can ensure that our lives have an eternal purpose that transcends our earthly existence, and in this way, be part of His work for eternity. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more interesting content like this. I would also love to hear your thoughts on these men of the Bible and what lessons you have learned. Leave your comment below and share this video with those who need to hear this message. See you in the next video, and may God bless you.